I was very happily Lutheran, very happily where I was. And it's funny, like as you sort of articulate the position that I took, I realized I did have that very like give it your best shot. I'm not going to try and prove you wrong for every group except Catholicism. I was very
Oh, that's
pointedly
funny.
trying to get them out of the running, right? Um, but yeah, like initially going in, I mean, I just remember a lot, like there were several doctrines that I like when I learned that Catholics believed them initially, they just seemed like preposterous to me.
Mhm.
Um, like a sort of distinction between mortal and venial sin just like seemed insane. I remember when when someone first like articulated what the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary was, like I got mad. I was like in my college dining hall. I was like yelling at our, dining table. I was like, this is ridiculous, so stupid.
Hey guys, welcome back to Let's Talk About It with Jackie and Megan. Today we have another interview, but this interview is one of my best friend's husbands. He's going to share his story, Sam Landon, about how he converted from being an LCMS Lutheran, which is what Megan is now, to being Catholic. So it's a little bit of a different perspective than we've had in our past couple interviews or any of our interviews in the past, honestly. So, a little bit about Sam. Sam grew up in East Tennessee, but has lived in Chicago since 2017. He received his master's degree in religious studies, specializing in New Testament and early Christianity from the University of Chicago in 2024. He now works in campus ministry, helping college and graduate students grow in their relationship with Jesus Christ. In his free time, he enjoys reading early Christian and medieval writers, playing the mandolin, spending too much time making coffee, I relate, and going on walks with his wife, Viviana, who is one of my best friends. Shout out the V. Woo. So yes, Sam, I guess we'll just let you can just share an overview of your story, whatever you want to share about your journey from being Lutheran to converting to Catholicism.
Yeah, for sure. So where to be? I guess East Tennessee is where I should begin. So, like that says, I grew up East Tennessee, grew up Lutheran. Not a whole lot of Lutherans in East Tennessee, but they're around. So I grew up going to a LCMS church, really good community, really good congregation. Um, for most of my adolescence and then like early teen years, I was going, I mean, initially because my mom told me I was going. What is an 8-year-old going to do? Except what their mom tells them. But then, especially like towards the later parts of middle school, early high school, I would continue going to church because one, I saw friends there who I didn't go to school with, so I just wouldn't have seen them otherwise. And the other reason being very much this attitude of, Christianity is probably not true, but if it is, hell sounds really bad, so I would like to not go there. That was like very, like I have clear memories of being like 11 and more or less thinking that. Um, so that like kept me going, right? Like the Lord used it. Um, that continued until I was about 15 or 16. Um, and then, and this sort of could be a whole thing unto itself, but with that church, we went on like this short-term mission, like helping out with like a summer camp in Baltimore. Um, and part of that was like sort of decompress at the end of the day, right? Time of prayer, stuff like that. And during one of those days, about halfway through, I started just like feeling a thing that I had not felt before. It was this very like foreign experience. It was, this cocktail of like a real conviction of sin, like, oh, I'm deep up the river. But also just this profound sense of being loved in the midst of that and of being
Mm.
forgiven, right? So like deep sinner, but loved, receiving mercy, like just all of that and just growing, 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 like in this, I don't know, like 5 minute period of time. And I remember from this sort of group activity, I excused myself. I went to the bathroom and I just like broke down. And I was just like, okay, okay, whatever else is the case, God is definitely real and Christ is definitely Lord. Like,
Mm.
sure of that. So that was like 15, 16. That took some time to really settle in. Um, some things needed to change. And part of that was part of that process for me of like settling into that, like wanting to actually be a Christian and live as a Christian involved starting to go to a different LCMS church. Not because the church I grew up at is called Grace Lutheran. If you're in East Tennessee and looking for a LCMS church, it's good. Not because Grace Lutheran was bad at all, but I just kind of wanted like a hard reset, like break some habits, just of sort of goofing off in church. It's like, okay, I'm used to not taking this seriously in this space. Like I want to go to a different space, but still LCMS. So I started going to a different one that church I grew up in helped plant. So like a very close relationship. Like my uncle led worship there. Like it was a very, about as sort of simple of a transition as you could get. I started going there. And that continued sort of through the end of high school for me. So I got my footing for like a year and a half in that sort of Lutheran space. And I was like, okay, I feel more comfortable, as a Christian broadly. But Christians disagree about a lot of things. They disagree about a lot of important things. And they even disagree about like what is important, right? Like what is something that should divide congregations or denominations. What do I think the scriptures say about those various things, right? So around the time I was like about to go off to college, I started looking into these different like denominational points of disagreement, right? So I started with baptism and communion, right? Because that is a big divider. When I was growing up, hearing the Lutheran view, I kind of was skeptical of it. I was like, I don't know, it really seems like that is still bread and only bread. It really seems like, that child is just getting wet and nothing else, right? Um, so I started, looking into that, came eventually to a sacramental understanding of that, or of those two. And I kind of just continued doing that, right? Point by point, like what do denominations disagree on? Um, wanting to consider everything. I remember at one point in high school, I was like, maybe the Mennonites are right. Like maybe that's true, you know? Just really trying to not assume anyone was wrong, but sort of look procedurally at okay, what does this say? What does this say? What does this say? And checking back against the scriptures, right? And at a certain point, when you do that sort of process, like Catholicism has great name recognition, right? So I was like, okay, I gotta consider them. At a certain point, I started picking things to look into with the hopes of like ruling out Catholicism. Because I'd be like, okay, that's like the biggest one, whatever. Let's get it off the table. And then I can, actually become a Methodist or something. I don't know. So I started doing that, right? Picking these sort of Catholic particular things. But I just kept finding myself convinced from scripture, and eventually sort of started reading a little bit into the early church and how they practiced their faith, how they read the scriptures, that sort of thing. And I kind of just felt like I was like, dang, these Catholics should keep getting things right, it seems. Um, and the very condensed version is I did that until I felt like I had a good reason to not be every other denomination
Mhm.
except Catholic. And I was like, well, Christ is Lord. To whom shall I go? I guess I'll be Catholic. And so I had that sort of watershed like moment, I suppose, on a Sunday evening. I was going to meet with a Catholic friend independently who I'd sort of been talking through some of this stuff with on Thursday that week. I was like, okay, I feel like I want to be Catholic this Sunday night. If I still feel that way later this week, I'll do it, right? I'll do the process, whatever it is, which I didn't even really know. Um, and throughout the course of that week, it just sort of kept growing, like this sort of comfort and confidence in, the truths of Catholicism. And so that Thursday, told my friend, emailed the campus chaplain at my undergrad, uh, and started OCIA, or I guess it was RCIA at that time, the following Sunday and just sort of received that Easter, which crazy enough, that year in particular, was a day after my birthday,
Mm.
which was just like a
Oh.
really like crazy, crazy birthday present. Also meant my birthday was on Good Friday, which is also a weird experience, but that's a whole other thing. So yeah, that's my very sort of condensed story. Again, any part of that can sort of be expanded out. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's really interesting. And I think that's a good perspective to have too, of like, I'm going to examine what each sort of branch views fairly. Not looking at caricatures, but just give them their best shot, and not
Mhm.
just assume they're wrong. I think that's a great like attitude to have when you're going into this. I think a lot of times we have our like preconceived biases, like, well, obviously this group is wrong. They're
Mhm.
wacky. So yeah, I'll look into it, but I'm looking into it to like prove they're wrong. And so I love the like perspective you had as you were sort of looking at each of them, like, okay, like give it your best shot. Like, what is it? I think
Mhm.
that's great. You mentioned like baptism and the Lord's Supper being sort of like that first jumping off point. Was there
Mhm.
like particular doctrines or practices or maybe views on the sacraments that in comparison to your Lutheran upbringing you found especially compelling in the Catholic tradition?
Oh yeah, yeah. Things so th like things that I found especially compelling at like the beginning, so to speak. I mean, but by the end of the process, right? Somewhat obviously, yes. But at the beginning, honestly, no, I don't think so. Now that's not to say that I like hated Catholics or anything, but I was very happy where I grew up. And sort of I mean, at the very sort of beginning, I didn't fully understand like a lot of the sort of distinctions in, okay, baptism regenerates, right?
Mhm.
Lutherans say that, Catholics say that. There's a lot more nuance there. Same with the Eucharist. I didn't understand a lot of those particulars at the time. Um, but I was very happily Lutheran, very happily where I was. And it's funny, like as you sort of articulate the position that I took, I realized I did have that very like give it your best shot. I'm not going to try and prove you wrong for every group except Catholicism. I was very
Oh, that's
pointedly
funny.
trying to get them out of the running, right? Um, but yeah, like initially going in, I mean, I just remember a lot, like there were several doctrines that I like when I learned that Catholics believed them initially, they just seemed like preposterous to me.
Mhm.
Um, like a sort of distinction between mortal and venial sin just like seemed insane. I remember when when someone first like articulated what the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary was, like I got mad. I was like in my college dining hall. I was like yelling at our, dining table. I was like, this is ridiculous, so stupid. Anyway, that's just all to say, like I don't have any clear memory of a thing that really drew me in. I guess maybe one thing at times I was drawn to the idea of like a clarity of authority.
Mm.
That I did see the benefit to that,
Mhm.
but at some time, at some points in time, that really sort of was drawing me in very early on in that sort
Mhm.
of investigative process. But then later on, when I was sort of trying to look at that in particular, I was like, well, sure, I might find it convenient. That doesn't mean it's true. That doesn't mean the
Mhm.
Lord established it. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, yeah.
What were a couple of those things that you felt like were theological hurdles? And then how did you come to agree with the Catholic position? I'm sure, I mean, there were several things, I'm sure, but are there a couple that really stand out to you?
Yeah, yeah. Um, I'll say the two that sort of feel the biggest. One I already mentioned, it was this distinction between mortal and venial sin.
Mhm.
Um, which just very briefly, for those listening who are not super familiar, uh, in the New Testament, it talks about these sins that lead to death, these sins that do not lead to death. Everyone has to reckon with what the heck that means, right? And how you sort of reckon that out. Broadly, the sins that lead to death are called mortal. That's what mortal means. And the sins that do not lead to death are called venial, right? The idea is mortal sin is you destroying your relationship with God. Venial sin, you're deliberately harming it, right? That's like, I teach OCIA now, so that's like my very condensed definition of these things. But that just seemed ridiculous to me. Um, and when I say that, or when I hear that from other people, like who have a similar experience, I think it can seem ridiculous in one of two ways. Either this idea that, once you're saved, there are sins that can damn you, or the idea that there are sins that like are not intrinsically you turning entirely away from God, right? Like
Mm.
both of those ideas can seem preposterous to different, like honest Christians. For
Mhm.
me, the thing that seemed crazy was venial sin. The idea that there was a sin that was not me wholesale rejecting God.
Oh, interesting.
And that, for most of the time that I was looking into stuff, was sort of like bubbling under the surface as a like, I don't understand how this could possibly be the case. Like this just does not make a ton of sense to me. Um, yeah, and the way, I mean, it was that issue was really based a lot on this language in James, where it talks about, if you have, I think the examples he used are like stealing and murder. He's like, if you have stolen, do not say, I have not murdered. You've broken the law, right? If you've murdered but not stolen, don't point out that you haven't stolen. You've broken the law. You've broken one part, you've broken the whole law, right? Which just, again, to me, seemed like this very clear statement of, okay, like the problem is breaking the whole law. Anything breaks the whole law, ergo, sins are equal. Like that was the sort of thought process. Um, and the way that I sort of worked through a lot of that was in reflection on those other places where, okay, James does say that, but the Lord talks about these sins that will be forgiven in the next life and those sins that will not be, right? John talks about these sins that lead to death, these sins that do not. All of this has to fit together, right? It's the one Holy Spirit inspiring all of this stuff, saying it all. And it was through conversation with that friend I mentioned earlier that we sort of really worked through. For me, the big thing was realizing, okay, the thrust of that passage from James does not seem to be all sin is equal. The thrust of that passage seems to be, and I would stand by this, that basically do not try to justify yourself by pointing out the sins that you haven't committed, right? The point is you're in need of mercy, right? Like, do not sort of be puffed up. So but anyway, mortal venial sin was like one of the really big things for me, which kind of gives you a window into like my psyche, both at the time and even now, right? Like there was a real scrupulosity, sort of like fear of hell, difficulty with hope, that sort of thing. So that was a really big thing for me. And then the other big thing that I think is big for every Catholic convert is the papacy. Not because it's like
Just a
the
small
single
thing.
most important thing. It's just a
Pretty
small thing.
relevant right now.
It's very relevant right now. Long live Pope Leo. May he live forever.
Live forever.
Yeah. No, but that was big for me, and I think it's big for everyone because in a certain sense, once you accept that, you're implicitly accepting everything else, right?
Right.
And in a certain sense, it wasn't big for me because pretty early on, I came to the spot of, okay, I could see this being true. Like it wasn't one of those ones that struck me as just ridiculous, like venial sin, like the Immaculate Conception. But still, once everything else had sort of fallen into place, I was at a spot where I was between like Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. And one of, if not the like major dividing point is like, what is the authority of the Bishop of Rome? And I was like, oh, I do actually have to sort of think about what I see the scripture saying on this. And for me, like the big passage there was not Matthew 16, right? It's this passage at the end of the Gospel of John where Jesus talks to Peter, right? And he, Peter, do you love me? Yes. Feed my lambs. Peter, do you love me? Tend my sheep. Peter, do you love me? Feed my sheep. I might have gotten the order of that wrong, but those
you
three,
got it,
right?
Yep.
And at the time, that passage was just like sticking in my head. And I didn't know why. I sort of now know this is a way that sort of discernment works in my life, is like things just sort of stick in my craw. It's like, all right, well, at this point when it happens, I'm like, all right, well, I'll figure out what this means, what I'm supposed to, I guess. Um, but that just like was continually there, and I could not figure out why. And I was folding my laundry, and it came up again. It's like, why does this keep coming up? Why does this passage keep emerging? And it sort of clicked in that the Lord only says that to Peter. There's certainly a way in which it's a reversal of Peter's, threefold denial, but all of the other apostles, except for John, completely run away. But we don't get that sort of moment of repentance for all of them. We get it for Peter in particular, because Peter sort of has this role as the sort of spokesperson, we might say, for the apostles. And he alone is given that sort of threefold mission that I think also points to that role among the, at that point, 11. I was like, okay, so there's a real particularity to Peter here. And by that point, I'd already accepted this idea of apostolic succession, that there are men who succeed the apostles, right? I mean, it's in the phrase. And I was just thinking, okay, well, if I think that Peter had that role, and I think people succeed the apostles, my first thought would be someone succeeds Peter in that role. Now that theoretically could be false, but I feel like I would need a reason to think that, Peter succeeded, but that sort of role among the 11, among the 12, right, is not succeeded. And I just didn't see a reason to think that, and still don't see a reason to think that. And I sort of realized, okay, that's papacy. Like that gets me there. I'm on board with everything else. I'm accepting the authority of the Pope, the authority of the Bishop of Rome. That means I'm not Eastern Orthodox. Here I am. Yeah. So that's, again, medium length version of how I got there.
I'm interested how you got to the spot where it was like Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, why like being Protestant was not in your mind an option at that time.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was a slow sort of whittling down, right? Like point by point by point. So for me in particular, starting with like baptism and Eucharist, growing up in the United States, it was a very convenient place to start, because if you come to a strong sacramental view, a sort of not merely memorial view, you're cutting off a huge number of congregations and denominations, right? Not that they're terrible, not that they're not Christian, but okay, I don't think that's the fullness of truth, right? I don't think that's everything the Lord left us. So that sort of whittled it down to a relatively small number. And then mortal and venial sin, right, sort of this undercurrent the whole time. But then I think the next thing I looked at was apostolic succession. Like, do the apostles have successors in a sort of substantial way? Which if they do, okay, you need a substantial sort of church authority, right? Like you need a sort of, you need something meaty. Looking at intercession of saints and sort of a related question of like the role of the Blessed Virgin Mary. At some point, I accepted the possibility of multiple sacraments. I don't have a clear memory of thinking like, is marriage a sacrament? But being convinced of the possibility of it was there as well. The really clear thing I remember is whittling down to like Lutheran, Anglican, Eastern Orthodox, Catholic. And then I think it was around intercession of saints and a little bit of apostolic succession that I was like, I don't think I can really remain Lutheran, which made me really sad. I wanted to remain. And part of that was a comfort. Part of that probably was like a little bit of a pride thing. Like I was raised in the right thing. Way to go. But I was just like, I don't think I can. And I remember at a point in time, I was really excited to be Anglican. I was really like excited to go whole hog into that. And then some of the deeper stuff on the Blessed Virgin Mary, I was like, I don't know that this can really fit within an Anglican view. And some of the, again, meatier stuff on like bishops and authority there. through all of that's what got me to Eastern Orthodox Catholic. It is really funny sort of reflecting on it now with knowing more about all of these groups and all of these denominations. If I, went through this process knowing what I know now, it probably would have taken way longer, um, and been way more like painful, or at least the
Mm.
pain of it would have been much more extended. Uh, and there's also whole groups that I would have considered much more directly. Like at that point, I didn't really know what, Coptic Orthodoxy was. Um, so I was just sort of accepting the articulation of one person, two natures. Um, I think that's a good articulation, right? I now know it. I haven't become Coptic, but uh, yeah, that is the sort of set of dominoes that led me to those two, and then uh, breaking Catholic, so to speak.
Did you wrestle at all with views of justification? Because for me, that seems like a big sort of distinction between at least like Lutheranism and Catholicism. It kind of comes down to justification. Like, yeah, obviously the papacy is big, but
Yeah,
when it comes to
yeah.
doctrine, did you like wrestle at all with that?
Yeah, I remember the big thing was once I realized that or once I became convinced, people disagree over this point, I guess. Once I became convinced that there's no real way that the Catholic view can reasonably be considered, working for your salvation or fully earning your salvation, that was enough for me, at 18 years old to think sort of like I did with the papacy, like, okay, that's plausible. That could be. Um, Again, sort of down the road, it was really funny. Right after I became Catholic, I took a course called Protestant Reformations. Like it's about, you know, the early Protestant reformers, which was a crazy decision, a crazy choice to make. Sort of in that very new to Catholicism, the sort of
Mhm.
practice of it,
Yeah.
to read those things really directly. At that point, I started like much more focusedly being like, okay, yes, the Catholic position is plausible. And I thought that, but is it true? um, that was the point where that really became a live question for me, which I know is kind of funny. There's a lot of things that looking back on this process now, I'm like, what a weird way for me to have done that. But he works how he works, right? Um,
You were 18.
I was 18. What's he gonna do? What's the Lord gonna do? He's gonna work with what he's got. Um, And so, at that point, there was this real wrestling. For me, and Megan, I'd be interested to hear your sort of thoughts on this articulation, right? Like, truly and honestly. For me, I can never get past the idea that when I look at, a Protestant, especially a Lutheran articulation of forensic justification, I can never get past this sense of, okay, but it's not true. um, in the sense of, the Lord sort of declares a person righteous, without infusing a righteousness into them, right? There's no sort of, I don't want to say there's no change of the person, because, right, like Lutherans, of course, do believe that, like, you can't just sort of do whatever, right? But I think the way in which righteousness is possessed is more removed than the way that, like, the Catholic Church would articulate our possession of the righteousness of Christ. And so even when I sort of, look back at these things and I see like, okay, I can see how, some parts of Paul do seem to give a forensic view. Okay, okay, okay. I do just always personally come back to that sense of, okay, but if the Lord says that I'm righteous, but in a real sort of ground level way, I'm still not. I just don't see a way for that to work. Now, right, like, I'm not saying that therefore Catholicism 100%, right? Like there's other denominations I think that can sort of reckon with this. But yeah, that, like, for me, that's the thing that I just continue coming back to and came back to at that time. I'd
Mhm.
be curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think like for me, that is one of the biggest distinctions between Lutheranism and Catholicism is the infused righteousness versus like the foreign forensic applied righteousness.
Hmm.
And I know the way I look at it is that declaration of righteousness is my standing before God. So it is like I heard it described as I'm standing in a glass. And so, yes, God sees me, but the glass surrounding me is Christ as my perfect advocate. And so, when he's declaring me righteous, it's because Jesus stood in my place and said, "Look at me instead." And so, because of that, I am then free to live a holy life. I am free to partake in the sacraments and receive grace. I am free to go through this process of sanctification. And so there is like a real now and not yet reality because we are still on earth. We live in a broken, fallen world. I am still a sinner. I continue to sin, but I feel an immense sense of relief and hope in no matter what, no matter how many times I fall, no matter how many times I continue
Hmm.
to sin, that I fail to pursue holiness, that doesn't wreck my standing of God is viewing me as righteous because of Christ. Um, and so I think they're more similar than sometimes we give those views credit for, because
For
obviously,
sure, for sure.
we do believe like you can't just be like, all right, got it, cool, I'm on my way to heaven then. Like
Yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah,
very
yeah,
antinomian.
yeah,
But
yeah.
I think like just that like sort of that crux of it of I am declared righteous not because of anything I did, not because I'm even becoming holy, not because I have grace, not because of anything like that, just because of Jesus, just because he took my place and God is looking at him instead. Because of that, I'm now free to pursue holiness. I'm now free to receive grace. So it's sort of like a both and.
Yeah, yeah, yes, yes. I mean, right. So, I mean, again, right, like the thing, and I see the fruitfulness in that. Um,
Fight, fight. No, okay.
what I can't, again, this, I'm not trying to fight, but
No, no.
this is my thought.
Yeah.
I don't know how to reckon with or how to make sense of this language of the Lord declares me righteous. So if we imagine logical moments, right? Like the Lord declares me righteous. Okay, fully agree. Yes, he does. In the following logical moment, in a real substantial way, I am not righteous. Right? Like which I mean, this is the language of the sort of simile, right? Like the at once just and sinner, right?
Mm.
Um, I just don't feel like I can make sense of that. Another way that I would sort of articulate it is I think justification, I think it seems to me that justification is either a change on God's part or on our part,
Mm.
right? Like now, God is working the change either way, right? Fully. But framed that way, I think if you asked most Christians, okay, in justification, who is changing, God or you? I think the sort of intuitive response is like, well, it's a change relevant to me, right? Like God sort of remains himself. And I know that we're not talking about this sort of like change of substance. We're talking about a change of relation for sure, for sure.
Mm.
But I don't know how to, again, I don't really see a way to reckon. It doesn't make sense to me to talk about a change in relationship without, I know that God's not changing. So I don't know how to make full sense of that change in relationship without him working a change in me. Right. Even if you have a sort of change in the person and a change in relationship, a declaration, you then have to work out the order of those things, which is kind of this distinction between Catholicism and some like reformed views. But we're
Mhm.
setting that aside. Um, yeah, like that's what I can't get past
Mm.
for me.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. And like totally fair. Obviously, that's why you're Catholic. I think
Oh
for me
yeah,
personally, that's where Jesus comes in. Like, it doesn't make sense without Christ. It doesn't make
for
sense without
sure.
his sacrifice. It doesn't make, and I think of even the Old Testament, like you have the Israelites who are sinning and continually breaking God's commands. And the way they are absolved is a sacrifice of an animal. And God says,
Hmm.
okay, that animal took your place. Like the wages of your sin is death. I'm considering the death of this animal to cover what you have done. And in a much bigger, grander, fuller way, Christ is then that full sacrifice. So, yes, I haven't substantially changed and I don't suddenly become, you know, unable to sin anymore. I don't suddenly
Hmm.
become, someone who doesn't complain or grumble or anything like that. It's not an instantaneous, but in a very real way, God is saying you no longer have to die because someone died for you. And so that now and not yet, that just and sinner, I'm still growing. I still need God's mercy and grace daily, but
Hmm.
I no longer have to die, you know?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's fair. That's fair. We could continue going down that
Yeah,
Yeah.
this
I
could
was
be the
gonna
whole
say,
right.
episode.
I was gonna
Yeah.
say
Yeah. Yeah.
we
Yeah.
would agree with everything you said, but different. Yeah. Well, another kind of distinction with the views of, I guess, justification, well, is confession, like having that sacrament of reconciliation, which goes back to a distinction between mortal and venial sins. And did you have any issues with, was that a hurdle for you or disagreements with the sacrament of reconciliation being a part of the Christian journey? Because obviously that's a big difference, I think, between Lutheran and Catholic as well. And kind of ties in with like, justification.
Yeah. Yeah. Growing up, I knew that Lutherans like could do confession. There was something kind of, I don't want to say kind of like that because that sounds dismissive, but the way that the practice functions is just fundamentally different. So I knew that there was like an aspect of that. And I think
Mm,
because of that, it didn't seem crazy to me.
mm,
Um, I remember very experientially really valuing it and being just thrilled to have it. I mean, to sort of use the Lutheran language, right? Like it's this very clear external word
Mhm.
of forgiveness, right?
mhm,
Um, and I also just sort of again experientially remember having this feeling of, the first confession I did was face to face, which is sort of a people have different preferences within the Catholic world. Not getting into that, but for me, that was the first way I did it, right? Like looking at
mhm,
priests face to face, not like behind a screen. And having that experience of, for that first confession, I'm going through, I was baptized as a baby, I'm going through as best I can, like years upon years of ways that I've rejected the Lord, not lived the life that he sort of gives to me. Um, I'm just going through it. And to, right, this priest who I knows me reasonably well at this point, because I've been in RCIA and that sort of thing. And to just see him very experientially as this image of the Father, because he has now heard all of this stuff I've done and just sort of looks and gives counsel with nothing but mercy, with nothing but like peace and comfort. Um, and then absolves, right? And it's completely gone. Um, for me, that was just profoundly valuable. Um, and I've been blessed to have that sort of peace, comfort from really good confessors, uh, almost universally, right? I can only think of like one kind of negative experience in confession, and it was purely because in the moment I misunderstood something the priest was telling me, right? Like, um, so yeah, like for me, it was never that big of a hurdle.
mm,
Um, I think again, a huge reason for that was I was very open to, okay, I want to know what is true. Um, I remember at one point during this sort of process, I was like just crying on the phone with someone who I was talking with about this. I was just crying, 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 and I said like I just want to love God in the way He wants.
mm.
And I think, right, like that approach had animated so much of my experience, so much of my approach that, okay, confession didn't seem ridiculous. You know, he seems to give his apostles forgiveness to bind and loose, to forgive sin. Okay, sure. Seems like he does that. So maybe this is true. Now, the way that that interacts with mortal venial sin was a harder question because that brings in mortal and venial sin, but on its own wasn't a huge stumbling block for me either way.
Mhm.
Yeah. Something I find, I just want a little about confession is you said you've never had a bad confession. I have, where the priest is like saying, I'm like, oh
Mm.
my goodness. But what I think that can turn people away from the church or from the idea of confession. But what's beautiful about it is it like doesn't really matter if the priest says some ridiculous thing, like
Mm-hmm.
in his role as the priest, as long as he says like you are absolved in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Is that what he says? I forget.
I
Whatever.
absolve you.
I absolve you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Um, like I'm forgiven. Like I know I've been sitting there before and the priest is saying something and I'm like, you know what? I don't have like this, I don't have to take like this, agree with this. I just know that my sins are forgiven. That's why I'm here. Um, if they're saying something that does not reflect the heart of Christ, you know, very not merciful. So
Mm.
anyway, I'm just thinking people hearing, well, I've had bad confessions, you know.
Yeah, yeah. And for those who have had bad confessions, I'm so sorry. I cannot. I mean, like, I mentioned that one negative experience where, in hindsight, I misunderstood the priest. It took me a while to realize that that it was a miscommunication, not actual bad content, and it wrecked me.
Mhm.
So, for those who've had bad confessions,
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. It is Christ speaking, right? And where Christ is not speaking, well, Christ is not speaking. Don't receive it as Christ speaking.
Mm. I'm curious, so like the first time you visited a Catholic mass, was it before you were officially received? Were you already Catholic? What was that experience like? What was the thought process?
Yeah, yeah. So literally, my dad's side of the family is Catholic. So literally, the first mass I went to was my grandmother's funeral.
Mm.
Didn't really have any conscious awareness of it. And then the second mass I went to technically was a cousin's wedding. Putting those aside, because those were like middle school or before.
Mhm.
The first time I went to mass was, remember I talked about, there was a Sunday where I was like, okay, if I still feel like I want to be Catholic on Thursday, I'm gonna start the process. Okay. The first time I went to mass, or the third time, technically speaking, was the Sunday after that Thursday,
Mm.
which is the craziest possible like thing to do, I think. I think that is the silliest part of my story that I did not go to mass until I had this like full like intellectual assent
Huh.
Mm.
to Catholicism. Um, that's wild to me. And anytime, sometimes just like in my role in campus ministry, like I'll be talking to people and I will always tell them, if I'm telling them any part of my story and I say that, I'm like, don't do what I did. That's a really bad way to do it. It's a terrible way to do it. Uh, but yeah, so I accepted that I wanted to be Catholic and then I started going to mass. Um, and I remember being struck, and from my vague memories of that funeral mass and that wedding mass, I remember thinking a similar thing that it was very, very similar to like the Lutheran divine service that I'd grown up with for the most part. Um, it was, I mean, very, very similar, even in just like, not just the sort of basic structure, but even in what you do at each portion, right? Like when you stand, when you kneel, when you sit, that sort of thing. Um, that all said, the one thing that just like blew my mind in the best way was growing up, the sort of two Lutheran churches that I went to, when they did communion, uh, they would use, I looked these up before we started talking. I just see them called communion trays. I don't know if they have a more
Oh,
special name, but these
yeah.
like big circular plates that some, if it's holding the the wine, Uh,
All the little
you
cups.
you can have the little
At your
cups, and it has
Lutheran
this like
church.
insert that has these circle things. Okay, both Lutheran churches I went to always used those.
Interesting.
Always, always, always. And the big sort of point here is like they were using these like single cups.
Uh,
Um, and I know that within the LCMS, this is a debated point of practice over like common cup, single cup. I'm not entering into that. I guess I maybe am in a way, but I'm not trying to enter into that. But that is what I grew up with, right? Was single individual cup.
Mhm.
And seeing not just the reality of like the sort of common cup, the chalice, but the care with which, after everyone had received, after everything had been consecrated, the care with which the paten, the little plate for the host was cleaned. It was like washed with water, wiped down, dried off. And the chalice was like cleaned with water, the water consumed, wiped down. The precision and the care and the reverence with which that was done was so striking to me because I like that wasn't a thing that I had really thought about or a
Mhm.
thing that I knew would happen. But I remember seeing it because at this point, for a while, I'd been accepting that communion was the Lord's body and his blood. But seeing that, it just struck me like, of course, like if we really do believe that this is his body and his blood, like why, yeah, of course you're going to like take that care to clean in that way, to do everything that you can for it. And that just like that continued to strike me every time I went to Sunday Mass, every time I went to daily Mass for like years. Um, After that just blew my mind and was so moving. Um, yeah, yeah, yeah. Like I said, I'm sure that there are LCMS congregations that sort of do a very similar practice, or maybe
No,
there
it's
aren't. I
funny.
don't know.
It's funny you bring it up because my church currently uses the communion trays. But they're trying to slowly soft launch the common cup. So for Monday, Thursday, they had common cup. Um, and it's funny because they were talking about how the younger congregants are like gung ho, like all for that. It's actually the older
Hmm.
generation that
yeah.
they're
Hmm.
too Protestant. They're
Yeah,
like
yeah.
uncomfortable with it. So
That's
it's just
funny.
funny that you brought that up because it's something my husband and I have been talking about 'cause we're like common cup, common cup.
Yeah, yeah. I'm curious, and this is no judgment in this question at all. I've never seen a Lutheran congregation do that. Was I mean, like, what was the for that Monday, Thursday service with the common cup? What I don't just want to say what did they do with it because but like was there a very public process of the cleaning of it, the purifying of it, or was that not just like not within the flow of the service?
Kind of. I would say probably not quite as much as in a Catholic mass, but like our
Okay.
pastor had to consume the rest of the blood and
Hmm.
they like wiped it down with a
Yeah, yeah.
cloth.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool, cool.
Yeah, I'm interested. So, becoming Catholic, how has this affected your spiritual life, the different practices you have, either for the positive or the negative? How has this affected overall your spiritual life and your walk with Jesus?
Yeah, yeah. I've I mean I've found it to be tremendously enriching. The big things for me is I've found at once, I think that there's a much greater like treasury of spiritual practices, right? Like of ways of praying, whether it be, the Jesus Prayer, the Rosary, Lectio Divina. I could rattle on for, 5 minutes and an hour after that, probably. Um, so there's a much greater set of practices that are, recommended, we might say. But also, even within that, like there's greater guidance, I feel like. Just in my upbringing, I never felt like I had great guidance on how to pray, and especially how to like discern. I
Mm.
never felt like I got a good sense of that, um, of like how to listen to God beyond just a very sort of vague description. Um, whereas like within Catholicism, there's various sort of like ways that are much more clearly articulated for how to approach that. Um, that's something I found really fruitful. The other thing that I've just continually been thankful for is, and I've heard other converts say this, but the way that like nothing, when I look back on my, upbringing, the various things that I found really valuable, that I'm really thankful for, that none of those experiences and none of those practices are unreconcilable. Now, some of them might be like less commonly found, but there's nothing sort of intrinsically at odds. Whereas, if I, being Catholic now, became Lutheran, like some practices that I found really valuable, like the rosary as I pray it now, like not at the very least, not easily reconcilable. Um, and that's something that I've just sort of been continually thankful for. That it's just sort of this, my experience has been just this embracing a greater fullness without really having to leave behind those things that I already knew were really profitable. Um, yeah, and just a greater like emphasis on regular prayer and silence has been really good, especially for me. I have this real tendency to like noise, to like to talk. And so just this emphasis on like silence, right? Of receiving the Lord and being in his presence. I've just felt like that's been much more deeply and pointedly emphasized. And so that's been tremendously helpful. I guess I would also say like the very clear opportunity for daily worship within a congregational setting, right? Daily mass is generally what I'm talking about. Some Protestant traditions have something like that. It probably doesn't involve communion, but just the proliferation of that as an option has been, I mean, just really valuable. Yeah.
Yeah, like say Ignatian spiritual discernment.
Oh yeah.
Something that Protestants make, and you got to bring it in. Anyone can use it. It's just was obviously from a Catholic
I'm hearing
tradition.
Protestants like integrate it
Yeah,
more
I mean, you
more
can. There's nothing in
regularly.
it that would be at
I
odds, I
this
don't, I
is
don't think.
this I don't think so. This is really funny. This is a side note. A few weeks ago, I emailed one of my old Lutheran pastors who I hadn't talked to in forever, but I was just thinking, I was like, I should talk to Pastor Matt and just tell him how thankful I am. Like, because he just was tremendously helpful to me, like in that becoming more firmly Christian time. And I sort of like briefly was like, hey, really thankful for what you did. Just so you know, like I'm Catholic now, I'm in ministry. Thanks for everything, something like that. And he wrote back, he's like, oh, that's great. Like some of the best spiritual practices or prayer practices for me right now, I've learned from Jesuits. So just like in that like integration of Ignatian stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
That's wonderful. My first ever silent retreat was Catholic.
With our old organization we worked with, that was
Oh, nice.
Opus Dei. So I was very Opus
Yes.
Dei style,
Very good.
with the
Love
reflections and yeah,
love Opus Dei.
yeah.
I know Opus Dei has some controversy.
I was gonna
I
say,
I have
oh
found
no,
Opus
that's a whole other can of worms.
I have found Opus Dei valuable.
Yeah.
That's
Mhm.
all I'm gonna say.
Yes. I'm interested out of all of the like what is your favorite aspect of now being Catholic? Maybe that's hard to pick
I had to
one.
pick one.
You gotta just pick one.
I'm gonna give a slightly jokey answer, mainly to buy myself time to think of a bigger answer. One thing that I like saying to people is like a big leg up that Catholicism has on especially other religions, is that it's true. So in some sense, that's my favorite part.
Burn.
That is a jokey answer. That is a jokey answer. You can also apply this joke to Christianity, right? Like a big leg up to
I like
Christianity
being
or
right.
other religions
Yeah.
is that it's
I like
true.
that I'm right and you're wrong.
Yeah, I like, well, not even like I'm right. It's just like
Right. Yeah.
it accords with reality. That is a
Mm.
jokey answer. Um, I think the way that Catholicism can bring all things to itself and sanctify them and elevate them. And that, I know that that's a very broad description. What I mean by that is like the way that I think more than any other denomination, the second best might be Anglican, maybe, but the way that it can remain authentically itself, authentically Catholic, while integrating just so many different cultures and so many different expressions, even within the liturgy in the sort of various rites, RITE, of the church.
Mhm.
And this, I mean, this is also part of the thing I said earlier of, I haven't had to leave anything that I found really valuable behind. Praise and worship music, does not sort of come from a Catholic place, but it can be fully integrated
Mhm.
in an authentic and in a fruitful way. That's something that I have found just profoundly valuable. And I think that, again, you can see this in the sort of academic approaches people can take to Catholicism and the very experiential approaches people can take. The way that it appropriates or can be appropriated to the whole of a person's life through really consistent prayer, through like even daily participation in the liturgical life of the church. Um, it just seems to me the sort of most simultaneously like the most human expression and the most divine expression, right? Of Christianity, of the life that Jesus gives. That sort of like I continually like marvel at it.
Mm.
Um, that's probably my favorite thing. Yeah.
Yeah. You kind of touched on the different cultures, but I was struck by this was my first time because when Pope Francis was elected, I was like going through it and I was like not even really I was like, I don't know if I want to be a Christian. I'm over this. But this time I was very invested and just like watching the whole world was so captivated and then watching how many people were in St. Peter's Square from so many different
Hmm.
cultures. I was like, this is just such a universal church. And that's what even lower C Catholic means.
Hmm.
Universal.
Hmm.
And I don't know, that was just, it was so moving and almost convicting and just beautiful. Like it
Hmm.
is so universal. And
Yeah. Yeah.
how the Pope really brought so many people together was, I don't know, it was stunning to me. Um, Especially in our ever growing secular world, you know.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
I'm
yeah.
curious, so you mentioned your dad's side of the family, at least extended, is Catholic. You grew up very Lutheran. What was the reaction from your family or even like close friends when you converted?
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, for the most part, like positive. Um, the sort of more religious part. I mean, I guess I'll start with the more secular parts of my family. The more secular parts of my family very much took the approach of like, that floats your boat. That makes you happy. Love it for
What's
you.
the difference?
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
kind of, right? Um, so there was that. And even for the most part, the more sort of religious, more practicing uh, parts of my family were, still happy, right? Like, I never really grew up with this idea that Catholics weren't Christian. Certainly grew
Mhm.
up with the idea that like they were wrong. They brought a lot of problems in, but they're still in the same family. Um,
Mhm.
so for the most part, it was positive. I won't name particular family members, but there
We
were
have
some
it.
places that it was really rocky for a while.
Mhm.
Um, in well, I guess to really tell the story, I do need to say a little bit. It was one of my parents. It was my mom. Um, there was a lot of yeah, I know. I
Yeah.
like how I said like, oh, I can't really say. Now I'm
I
just going
can't
to
name
say.
names. It was a
Um,
parent. It was my
It's my
mom.
it
mom.
was my mom. Why?
So,
If I say it's my parent, it's like well, my dad was raised Catholic. I'm kind of implying. Um, that was painful. And
Mhm.
that sort of had some discontinuity within our relationship that I mean, it's, several years in the background now. Uh, we've worked through a lot of it. It's not as raw as it once was. And I like, when I visit home, like I will often like still go to that church I grew up in with her, and oftentimes she'll come to mass with Viviana and I. So there is a sort of, we've settled a lot, but especially early on there was some rockiness there. Um, Friends were mostly positive. It was really interesting, like, because I converted in college, I was telling a lot of my like secular friends, and they like were weirdly excited for me. Like they were really
Oh,
happy.
interesting.
Um, so yeah, I did have one like pretty close LCMS Lutheran friend, who I was involved in an interdenominational ministry with, who was kind of like surprised and was a little, I mean, she sort of said later she was a little sad because it was like I had a Lutheran friend and now I don't. Um, but even, I mean, even that, friendship, like long term was fine. It was just a little rocky. There was a funny moment thinking back on like secular friends and how they responded. A couple years in, I had a friend asked to interview me about my conversion. They were like, "It's for a class. I'm not going to tell you what class or why until after the
Oh,
interview."
Oh
And it made sense. It was they were like, I don't want this to sort of affect how you tell the story. Like, okay. And this friend I think was a psychology major,
oh
and
boy.
like once I told the whole story, she was like, "Okay, so I'm interviewing you because I have to write a paper on deviant behavior."
Oh no.
And she made very clear, like, it wasn't meant to be a disrespectful thing, but it just descriptively, like behaviors that are outside of like normal social behaviors, like religious
Well, I guess at U
conversion,
Chicago, it is outside
religious
of
conversion at the
normal.
University of Chicago, right? Like in this was like, I don't know, 2021 or something, 2020,
Wow.
2019. Like it just is not a normal experience, right? It's not
No,
a
not fair at
normal thing for
all.
people to go through.
Yeah.
And so she interviewed me for this. I forget what, I think she did well on the paper, but just in the category of,
you were sufficiently deviant.
I
Yeah.
was sufficiently deep. I was sufficiently, abnormal.
Tough.
So, yeah.
That's funny. I guess to finish off, we have, especially online, there are a lot of people questioning the denomination that they're in, questioning the tradition that they're in. And would you have any advice for someone that is questioning their theology, kind of, yeah, in that space where maybe they're looking at all of the different options? Would you have any advice for them looking back? Some
Hmm.
wisdom to give them?
Yeah.
Then
Yeah.
go to mass earlier.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, like, the biggest thing is like don't sort of just sit in the armchair.
Mm.
I mean, I think this is part of like discernment more broadly. Trying to like trying to find, where the fullness of truth is, the fullness of the life that Jesus gives. Trying to find it by only like sitting in your armchair and reading is like trying to figure out if you're supposed to marry a certain person by just like looking at their Facebook. Like that is the equivalent.
Mhm.
Maybe it's just texting, right? Maybe there's something else, but sort of for the dating analogy, it's very clear. Like, no, you got to like do some stuff, right? You need to like approach them, actually like get a embodied sense of what is happening.
Mhm.
Um, because if you read side by side, like, the Westminster Confession, the Augsburg Confession, and the Council of Trent, right? Like, you're probably going to come away from each of those documents being like, oh, these people are really sincere and they're
Mhm.
really reading scripture pretty seriously,
Mhm.
right? So if you're not engaging further than that, I think it's just going to be really not just confusing, but like unsatisfying, and you're not going to get everywhere because we're not brains in a jar. We're embodied and living. So yeah, go to services, right? Talk with like real people. Um, and I would also say, like, as much as you're able, sort of look at what the actual like practice of those denominations is outside of Sunday worship. Um, Look at what that is and be really honest about what your objections are and to what degree you can try some of those practices, right? So if if you think, if your objection to like prayers to the saints is not that it's idolatrous, but that it's like unprofitable, right? If that's really what your objection is, okay, you could try praying the rosary, right? If you think it's not idolatrous, but just a sort of waste of time, well, you could waste 20 minutes to try a thing, right? Like, right? I know that's a very Catholic example. And if you think it's idolatrous, I'm not saying do that. I don't think it is. But, right? Like that's just in the category of being honest about what precisely you're objecting to. And even if like, asking, is this a real objection or does it just kind of give me the heebie-jeebies? Right? Like, do I think relics really do nothing or does it just seem really foreign to me? Like just sort of having that awareness, I think is really good. Alongside that, I do think, investigating things deeply is good. And I would say like, I tend to like things that are older. For me, a big part of my story was the early church and looking at what it said. So, I think these guys called the Apostolic Fathers, these sort of first generation of Christians, right after or even contemporaneous with the apostles. Their stuff's really fruitful, been really valuable to me. So I think that, and I think they're very profitable to read. So some of those names are like Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp. Those are really the two big ones, I think. They're phenomenal. I think also this is a really like pointed recommendation. That I don't think I've ever heard anyone else recommend, but there's a novel by John Henry Newman called Loss and Gain. It is, I think, the first thing that he wrote after his conversion from Anglican to Catholic. And it's about like a university student going through a sort of conversion from a kind of Anglicanism to Catholicism. Now, it has a really particular perspective, of course, being by John Henry Newman at that time in his life. But I think that it really accurately like portrays a lot of that anxiety and sort of sorrow of being in that spot of like not knowing where to be in a way that I only read it after my conversion, but I found tremendously comforting that like, oh, that anguish that I felt at one point, was not unusual, right? This sort of great intellectual, great holy guy felt something similar, right? And sort of could speak really directly to that. I found that really valuable. And as much as possible in the midst of that sort of anguish that someone might be feeling, like, remember why you're doing this, right? Like that it's about Christ and his mercy, right? He is not the accuser, right? He's not the one who's sort of giving you this detailed checklist. Now he does give a life for us to live, right? He does, it's not to say that like right doctrine and right living are unimportant, but remembering what you're here for, and as much as you're able, like taking steps back. There's a spiritual writer that I really like, John Towler, is one of these medieval guys, who also really popular among Lutherans, at least at one point in time. Crazy, neither here nor there. John Towler, but he uses this language of, the spiritual life is kind of like you're farming, right? And when the sort of storms come by, these like troubles, you don't continue, plowing the field. You retreat into the barn, right? Like you go back to that place where you can rest, where you have consolation. Not that you stay there forever, but you return to those places of where you felt the Lord giving you that consolation, giving you that comfort, whether that's passages of scripture, it could be certain like worship music, right? It could be certain practices, right? Like taking a step back and being able to like, recuperate intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, and then, okay, going back out. Because especially if this is a longer investigative process, it can, I think, really tear people up. And just take a sec, take a breath. He wants, the Lord wants you to find the truth even more than you do. So rest in him, trust him. Yeah, I know that's kind of a lot of separate things, but yeah.
No, I think that's beautiful and very encouraging. I think the phrase that keeps coming to mind hearing your story is like we should be curious, not condemning. Like you're curious about all
Mm,
these different denominations, not condemning of them, but also with yourself. Like be curious
hmm.
instead of condemning with yourself.
Yeah.
So even just
Yeah.
that self-awareness of asking yourself, okay, why do I believe this practice feels true or not true? Like be
Hmm.
curious. Don't just condemn yourself immediately or cut something off. So I think that's very poignant advice for someone who is maybe in like the trenches of it. Like, hey, maybe
Hmm.
just take a week where you're not reading the church fathers and you just pray and you go to bed early. Like maybe that's good for you, you know?
Sleep. This,
Yeah.
oh,
Sleep.
that's the
Yeah.
fourth piece of advice. Just sleep. Just sleep. Sleep's so
Rest.
important. Anyway. Yeah.
Maybe put the YouTube down.
Definitely put the
Yeah.
YouTube down.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sam, for coming. I love
Yes.
hearing people's different stories and what personally drew them into what tradition. And obviously, I'm very happy you became Catholic. That's part of why we met, because then you married one of my best friends who actually
So
became
true.
Catholic after you.
Became
So
Catholic
you guys
after
became
me.
Catholic separately.
Yes, we became
Yeah,
Catholic
interesting.
some number of years apart. It's confusing because her reception
Yeah,
got delayed by
but
COVID.
COVID, yeah.
So it not neither here nor there.
Whole thing. Yeah.
But yeah.
Thank you for sharing your story. And if, of course, anyone had nice comments, be nice in the comments or
I'm
questions.
I'm sensitive.
Yeah. We will try to, if you have any suggestions for other episodes or things that maybe you have questions about from this episode or past ones, let us know and we will try to do that. But yeah, keep talking about it.